When 12-year-old Cassie Lawrence was wrongfully arrested by a group of so-called HOA guards for something as innocent as a child's swing, her family's world was turned upside down. These fake enforcers, wielding authority they didn't have, left Cassie to face humiliation and fear, knowing they were abusing their power without remorse. But when her mother, Supreme Court Judge Taylor Lawrence, learned of the injustice, she unleashed a force no one saw coming, a fight that would leave her enemies powerless. Justice didn't just prevail, it shattered the very foundation of their deceitful reign. Part 1. Shock. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon when 12-year-old Cassie Lawrence came home from school. Her backpack, heavy with textbooks and assignments, slung lazily over her shoulder as she entered the house. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting a warm glow over the yard. Her mother, Judge Taylor Lawrence, was inside preparing dinner, so Cassie thought she'd take the chance to help out by tidying up the backyard. It wasn't much, just pulling up a few weeds, putting the garden tools back in place. But it was routine, something to pass the time. She had just reached the back gate when she noticed them. A group of people in vests emblazoned with the letters HOA, Homeowners Association. Strange, Cassie thought. She didn't know anyone from the HOA, and they didn't usually show up unless there was a problem with the neighborhood rules. Before she could even make a move, one of the men stepped forward. His name tag read James Dorset. His eyes were sharp, his expression unbothered, like he'd done this 100 times before. "Cassie Lawrence?" he asked, his voice flat and official. "You are under arrest for violating HOA regulations." Cassie froze. Arrest? For what? She hadn't broken any laws. She hadn't even been outside the house in the last few days, other than school. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Officer Dorset continued without waiting for her reply, unfazed by her confusion. "Your property is in violation of the HOA guidelines, specifically the unauthorized installation of a child's swing in your backyard." Cassie blinked. A swing? That swing had been in the backyard since she was 5, something her mom put up for her when she was little. How could it suddenly be an issue? She looked at the group of people standing behind Dorset. Their faces were as cold as stone. No sympathy, no attempt to explain, just a sense of finality in the air. She felt the weight of their gaze, like they were ready to take her without question. "But it's just a swing," Cassie stammered, her voice cracking with disbelief. "It's been there for years. I didn't—" "Doesn't matter," Dorset interrupted, his tone unyielding. "Rules are rules." Cassie's heart raced. She tried to take a step back, her fingers tightening on the wooden fence. She thought of running, of yelling for her mom, of finding someone to help. But before she could even make a move, one of the other officers stepped forward and gently but firmly grabbed her arm. "Don't try anything. We're not here to argue," the officer said, his voice low, almost threatening. The air felt thick, suffocating. Cassie's mind raced, but her body felt paralyzed, as though the whole world was spinning around her, out of control. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she fought them back. What was happening? Why was this happening? She had always followed the rules. Her family paid taxes, kept to themselves, and never caused any trouble. They were the kind of neighbors everyone liked, quiet, respectful. She had always been proud of that. And now this. For a children's swing? Before she could process it all, they were already moving her towards their van, their grip on her arm tight, unrelenting. She didn't even have a chance to call her mother. They wouldn't let her. The world around her seemed to close in, the whole neighborhood quiet and unaware of the injustice unfolding in their midst. Her heart pounded in her chest as she was driven away, the streets blurring past the window, her stomach heavy with fear. Was this really happening? It was all too surreal, like something out of a nightmare. As they pulled into the local station, Cassie's mind went blank. How could anyone do this to her? Her breath caught in her throat as they led her inside. The doors slammed shut behind her, and the cold, sterile smell of the station filled her senses. There was no one here to help her, no one to make sense of it all. It felt like she had just entered a world where nothing made sense, and everything was wrong. Cassie's hands shook as she stood there in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a violation of everything she knew to be right. And she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow she was just beginning to realize how dangerous it was to stand up to people who had too much power and not enough accountability. The moment Judge Taylor Lawrence stepped through the door of her home, she felt it. A chill, a wrongness in the air. The house was quiet, too quiet. Cassie wasn't in the living room, wasn't upstairs in her room. Taylor's heart skipped a beat as she quickly moved through the house, calling her daughter's name. Panic began to spread like wildfire in her chest. She found Cassie's backpack by the front door, still half open, textbooks spilling out. The uneaten lunch was on the counter. Her daughter hadn't even gotten to her homework. It was all wrong. Where was she? Taylor's mind raced through all the possible scenarios, but none made sense. Cassie had been fine when she left for school. She hadn't mentioned anything unusual. Then came the call. A neighbor had seen some strange people taking Cassie away. Men dressed in HOA vests, acting like they had authority. The word arrest had been thrown around. Taylor's blood ran cold. No, this can't be happening. She immediately called the local police chief, her voice calm, but underneath her anger was beginning to build. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The conversation started out routine, as she tried to mask the rising panic that was threatening to break through. But as the chief explained what had happened, how the HOA officials had arrested her daughter on charges of violating rules Taylor knew didn't even exist, her control began to slip. "I don't understand, Chief," Taylor said, her voice tight with barely contained fury. "You're telling me a group of people pretending to be officers have taken my daughter, and no one stopped them? Do they have any legal authority?" The chief's response was quick, dismissive. "Judge Lawrence, these people are part of a local HOA initiative. They've been making rounds to enforce property guidelines. Technically, they didn't break any laws." Taylor felt her hands tighten around the phone, her fingers digging into her palm. "I'll decide what's legal. Thank you." Her voice was a low, lethal calm. "Put them on the phone. Now." It was clear from the moment the officer on the other end spoke that he was less than cooperative. His tone was patronizing, like she was just another annoyed citizen calling about some trivial issue. But the moment she mentioned her position as a judge, the change was instant. The officer's voice grew colder, more clipped. His responses grew shorter, more evasive. Taylor could hear the condescension in his words. He didn't care who she was. He didn't care about the law. These people had done what they wanted, and now that they had a Supreme Court judge on the line, they could just brush her off. Her jaw clenched. How dare they? There were no answers, no apology, no sign that anyone was going to correct this. And all the while, in the back of her mind, she could hear Cassie's voice, scared, confused, calling out for her little girl, locked in a cell. As soon as the phone call ended, Taylor's composure shattered. The rage she had tried to keep in check now burned through her veins, hot and unrelenting. The unfairness of it all gnawed at her. How could something so monstrous happen in her own community, in her own home, under her very nose? She dropped to the phone, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. How had they gotten away with it? These so-called HOA guards had no legal power, no right to arrest anyone, let alone a child. But the more she learned, the more the truth hit her like a hammer. There was no system in place to stop them, no one who cared enough to intervene. Taylor couldn't stand it. She couldn't just sit back and let this happen. The way the officers had dismissed her, like she was nothing more than a nuisance, burned in her chest. The arrogance, the abuse of power, the casual disregard for her daughter's well-being. Her mind raced, heart pounding, as she tried to formulate a plan. They will pay for this. Her position as a judge, her influence, her resources, these were her weapons now. And she would use them. The legal system had failed her today, but that didn't mean she was powerless. It only meant she had to fight harder. Taylor turned on her heel and walked to her office. She could feel the weight of her anger settle into something colder, more calculated. This wasn't just about righting a wrong anymore. This was about something deeper, something more personal. This was about revenge. The people who'd done this weren't just petty criminals. They were abusers of power, and she couldn't let that slide. Her thoughts hardened, the rage turning into a quiet, intense fury that burned like a slow fuse, ready to explode. No one, not the HOA, not the so-called officers, not the system that allowed this to happen, would get away with it. She would make them regret it, and she wouldn't stop until every one of them was held accountable. Taylor Lawrence's fingers dug into the wood of her desk as she sat in her home office, staring at the documents spread out before her. Her mind was racing, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The world she had always known, the world of laws, procedures, and justice, had been shattered, and now it was time to restore the balance. But this time, it wouldn't be the calm, measured approach she was accustomed to. This was personal. She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with a screech that echoed through the room. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She wasn't just a figure of authority. She was a mother, a protector of her child, and that made her power even more dangerous. Taylor picked up the phone and began dialing. First, she called her colleagues, her trusted network of legal professionals, explaining the details of the situation. She demanded full access to any and all information about the HOA's actions. They'd crossed a line, and she needed to know everything. The system had failed her, and now she would tear through it with her own hands. The truth she uncovered was as infuriating as it was horrifying. The HOA, in all its so-called authority, had no legal right to arrest anyone. Their guards had no jurisdiction, no legal foundation for what they'd done to Cassie. The law had been trampled. And for what? Because of a swing in her backyard? Taylor's jaw tightened, her grip on the phone nearly crushing it. The more she learned, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, twisted pattern of power abuse. They were used to getting away with things. They were used to people backing down, but she wasn't going to back down. Taylor hung up the phone, her mind made up. She immediately called her lawyer, her voice steely with resolve. "Prepare the paperwork," she said, her words sharp. "We're filing a lawsuit against the HOA and everyone involved. I want the full weight of the law on them." There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. The anger she felt was no longer just an emotion. It had solidified into a focused, unrelenting drive. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter anymore. She was fighting for something bigger, something fundamental. She was fighting for justice. With the necessary documents in hand, she headed to the courthouse. The air felt heavy as she walked through the halls, the weight of the case pressing down on her. This was no longer just another case to her. It was the case, the one that would define everything, the one that would prove to everyone that Taylor Lawrence wasn't someone to be underestimated. When she stepped into the courtroom, all eyes turned to her. The room fell silent, but she didn't flinch. She had trained for moments like this. She had spent her career making decisions that changed lives, cutting through the chaos to find clarity. But today, it felt different. The stakes were higher. Her daughter's future was on the line. Her own future was on the line. Taylor adjusted her glasses, her face unreadable, her posture unwavering. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the calm confidence of a woman who knew she had truth on her side. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. The opposition, to lawyers representing the HOA, people used to pushing boundaries and evading consequences, would be relentless. But none of that mattered. Taylor had the law, and she had an anger that burned hotter than any of their tricks or lies. As she took her seat, she could feel the intensity building. The room was alive with tension, but she was steady, focused. The anger she had kept inside was no longer a storm. It was a weapon. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her, wasn't going to let them hide behind their power. The gavel came down, and the trial began. Taylor's voice cut through the room as she laid out the case with precision, outlining the wrongful arrest, the illegal actions of the HOA, and the emotional distress caused to her daughter. Every word she spoke was filled with purpose, and every piece of evidence she presented felt like a hammer striking the walls of the system that had failed her. But even as she spoke, Taylor knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't just fighting to win a case. She was fighting to send a message, the kind of message that would echo long after the trial ended. Taylor Lawrence had always delivered justice, but today she was going to make sure that everyone learned just how far her reach went. She wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. This courtroom was her battlefield, and the moment had arrived for her to show everyone no one messes with her family. The courtroom had been a battlefield, the trial an intense, drawn-out fight, but in the end, Taylor Lawrence stood victorious. Weeks of preparation, sleepless nights, and tireless effort culminated in a final moment that would forever alter the course of her life and her daughter's. When the judge's gavel came down, the court's decision was clear. The HOA's actions had been unlawful. Their so-called guards had no legal right to arrest anyone, and the court ruled that Cassie's wrongful detention, as well as the emotional toll it had taken on the Lawrence family, warranted compensation. The amount was substantial, a sum meant to not only address the wrongful arrest, but also to send a clear message. Abuse of power had consequences. The moment Taylor heard the verdict, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders, but the relief was fleeting. There was still work to be done, and the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Later, as Taylor pulled into the driveway of her home, with Cassie by her side, she could see the sun beginning to set behind their house. It was a peaceful evening, the kind of evening they used to have before everything had gone sideways. And yet, as she looked over at Cassie, she felt the satisfaction of knowing her daughter was home, safe, free, and finally able to breathe without the shadow of fear hanging over her. Cassie's smile when she stepped out of the car was all the confirmation Taylor needed. The legal victory wasn't just about the courtroom, it was about restoring the sense of justice, the feeling of safety, and most importantly, the bond between mother and daughter. They had done it. They had won. But for Taylor, the satisfaction didn't stop there. She wasn't just going to let the HOA slither away into the shadows, pretending nothing had happened. No, Taylor had one final piece of business to attend to, the one that would leave a mark on everyone involved. A week after the ruling, Taylor arranged a meeting with the HOA representatives, the very people who had dared to infringe on her family's rights. It was a moment she had been anticipating for days, a final confrontation that would punctuate everything she had fought for. She walked into the room with an air of quiet authority, her posture strong, her gaze unwavering. The representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she took her place at the table. There was no sign of the arrogance they had once displayed when they had first confronted Cassie. Now they were silent, tense, remorseful perhaps, but still unwilling to fully accept the consequences of their actions. Taylor didn't waste time with pleasantries. She looked each of them in the eye, and with the weight of the law behind her, delivered a message that would resonate far beyond that room. "Let me be perfectly clear," she began, her voice calm but firm. "You may have thought you could bully my family, that you could act with impunity, but I promise you this, no one in this country is above the law, not you, not anyone." She paused, letting her words sink in. The representatives shifted uncomfortably, but Taylor didn't relent. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could abuse their power without facing consequences. "I will never allow this to happen again, not to my family and not to anyone else. You may have won some small battles, but in the end, you'll find that justice is not something you can buy or manipulate. It's something you earn or fail to." With that, Taylor stood up, her gaze steady, unyielding. She could see the impact of her words on the faces of the HOA representatives. They were afraid, and that in itself was a victory. As she walked out of the room, she felt the full weight of her success settle around her. This wasn't just a legal victory. It wasn't just about the compensation, it was about the principle. The idea that no one could take advantage of the powerless, no one could trample on the rights of others without facing the consequences. This victory was hers, and it would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It wasn't just a legal triumph, it was a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what was right, even in the most difficult moments. Taylor knew, without a doubt, that justice could still be restored if you fought hard enough for it. As she drove home that evening, Cassie by her side, the world felt a little brighter. The fight had been long, and it had been hard, but they had won, and nothing could take that satisfaction away from them.